March 6, 1944, 28,000 feet above Berlin. Lieutenant James Howard felt his P-51 Mustang shudder as flak burst black and angry around him. Below, a formation of B-17s crawled across the German capital, vulnerable and alone. His fuel gauge showed half empty, but he was still here, still fighting, still protecting the bombers 600 miles from home. Every other Allied fighter would have turned back an hour ago, tanks dry, leaving the bombers to die. But Howard's Mustang kept flying, and in that moment, watching German fighters scatter before him deep in the heart of enemy territory, he realized something extraordinary. The war in the air had just changed forever. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to appreciate something remarkable. Right now, you might be watching this from London, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, or a quiet town in Montana. Wherever you are in the world, we're connected by our shared fascination with history's forgotten moments. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep exploring these incredible tales together. Now let's return to the skies over Europe, where an impossible idea was about to reshape everything. By early 1944, the American 8th Air Force faced a crisis that threatened to derail the entire strategic bombing campaign. They had the planes, nearly 2,000 heavy bombers capable of carrying the war to Germany's industrial heart. They had the crews, thousands of young men willing to fly through hell itself. They had the bombs, enough high explosive to flatten cities. But they didn't have range. Their escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only accompany the bombers 200 miles into enemy territory before fuel forced them to turn back. And when the escorts left, the killing began. German fighter squadrons waited just beyond that invisible line like wolves circling a wounded herd. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s tore into the unprotected bomber formations with cannons and rockets. On October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, 60 of 291 B-17s were shot down. Another 17 crashed or were scrapped upon return. In a single afternoon, 600 American airmen were killed or captured. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. The German pilots had every advantage. They operated from airfields scattered across occupied Europe, close to the action. They had radar stations tracking Allied formations hours before arrival. They could attack, land, refuel, rearm, and attack again while American bombers limped homeward through hostile skies. Most importantly, they had endurance. While American fighters sipped fuel nervously and watched their gauges, German interceptors could remain airborne for hours. The Luftwaffe wasn't just winning individual battles. They were winning the war of attrition that mattered most. American commanders knew the truth even if they couldn't say it publicly. Without fighter escort all the way to the target and back, strategic bombing wasn't strategy. It was slaughter. Every mission deep into Germany became a calculated sacrifice, trading young lives for marginal damage to enemy industry. The bombers kept flying because they had to, because stopping would mean conceding the air war entirely. But losses were climbing faster than replacement crews could be trained. Something had to change or the entire campaign would collapse. In Inglewood, California, at the North American Aviation Factory, a German-born engineer named Edgar Schmude was working on exactly that change. Schmude had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, watching his homeland descend into madness. Now, wielding a slide rule and an obsession with aerodynamic perfection, he fought back in his own way. The P-51 Mustang was his creation, sleek and fast with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that gave it speed to rival anything in the Luftwaffe. But it still couldn't fly far enough. Speed without range was just potential without purpose. The problem was simple but seemingly insurmountable. Fuel meant weight. Weight destroyed performance. The Mustang's elegant aerodynamics and carefully calculated center of gravity allowed it to outmaneuver German fighters in combat. Adding more fuel would shift that balance, making the aircraft sluggish, unstable, or worse. Every engineer at North American knew the cardinal rule. Never place significant weight behind the pilot's seat. A tail-heavy aircraft was a dangerous aircraft prone to stalls, spins, and fatal loss of control. It was written into every aeronautical textbook, taught in every design course. Schmood proposed breaking that rule. He wanted to install an 85-gallon fuel tank directly behind the pilot's head, inside the fuselage. Not in the wings where fuel belonged, not in external drop tanks that could be jettisoned. Inside the aircraft's body, shifting the center of gravity so far rearward that the plane would be fundamentally unstable until the tank burned down. When test pilots heard the proposal, they called it suicide. When engineers saw the calculations, they called it reckless. When commanders reviewed the design, they called it crazy. But Schmood had done something nobody else had considered. He had calculated what happened over time. Yes, with a full fuselage tank, the Mustang would be tail-heavy and dangerous. But what if pilots burned that fuel first, during the initial cruise to enemy territory? The tank would empty gradually over the first hour of flight. By the time the aircraft reached combat altitude over Germany, the center of gravity would have shifted forward naturally, returning the Mustang to its designed balance. The instability wasn't a flaw. It was a temporary condition, a deliberate sacrifice of safety for range. The math was elegant in its simplicity. An 85-gallon fuselage tank plus 75 gallons in each wing, plus external drop tanks, gave the Mustang a combat radius of over 750 miles. That meant it could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes over the target, and return home with fuel to spare. It meant American bombers would never fly alone again. It meant the Luftwaffe's advantage was about to evaporate. But first, someone had to prove the aircraft wouldn't kill its pilot. Test pilot Bob Chilton stood beside the prototype Mustang on a cool California morning, staring at the fuel tank mounted just inches behind where his head would rest. He had flown every variant of the P-51, pushed it through dives and rolls and high-altitude intercepts. He understood the aircraft's personality, its quirks and capabilities, but this modification changed everything. One engineer watching the pre-flight inspection muttered what everyone was thinking. That thing's going to fly like a brick with wings. Another said it would spin into the ground on takeoff. A third suggested having the fire trucks ready. Schmood himself climbed into the cockpit for the first test flight. He wasn't a combat pilot, wasn't even particularly experienced in high-performance aircraft, but he had designed every curve and surface of the Mustang. He knew the numbers. He trusted the physics. If the aircraft was going to fail, if his calculations were wrong, he would be the one to pay the price. The Merlin engine roared to life with its characteristic throaty growl. Ground crew stepped back. Schmood advanced the throttle and the Mustang began to roll. The takeoff was immediately alarming. The nose lifted sharply, aggressively, pulled upward by the weight behind the cockpit. Schmood compensated with forward stick pressure, trimming carefully to maintain level flight. At 5,000 feet, he switched to the fuselage tank and let it burn. Minute by minute, gallon by gallon, the balance shifted. The tail grew lighter. The nose came down naturally. After 15 minutes, the aircraft felt exactly as it always had, responsive, stable, eager. Schmood tested rolls, climbs, and tight turns. Everything worked. He landed, climbed out, and spoke 4 words that changed history. The aircraft is ready. Pilots were trained to burn 20 gallons from the fuselage tank before engaging enemy fighters. It became standard procedure, written into operational manuals and drilled into every P-51 squadron. Respect the timing, they were told. Understand the balance. The aircraft will feel wrong at first, then it will feel right. Trust the process. And they did, because the alternative was leaving their bombers to die. By December 1943, the first production P-51s with fuselage tanks began arriving in England. They were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the first unit to take them into combat. On December 13, 1943, Mustangs escorted bombers to Kiel, Germany, 450 miles from their base. On January 11, 1944, they reached Brunswick, 500 miles deep into enemy territory. And on March 4, 1944, they did what everyone said was impossible. They flew to Berlin. Over 700 B-17s and B-24s bombed the German capital under continuous fighter protection for the first time in the war. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled, expecting the usual pattern. American escorts would turn back at the border, leaving the bombers exposed. Instead, the Mustangs kept coming. German fighter commanders couldn't understand what they were seeing. American fighters over Berlin? Impossible. Their intelligence said it couldn't be done, that no Allied aircraft had the range. But the Silver Mustangs were there, diving from altitude, engaging Bf-109s and FW-190s with devastating effectiveness. The P-51 wasn't just present, it was dominant. Faster than German fighters at altitude, more maneuverable than anything except the FW-190 at low level, and now blessed with the one thing the Luftwaffe couldn't match: endurance. The hunted had become hunters. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard proved it on January 11th when he single-handedly defended a bomber formation against more than 30 German fighters. His wingmen had turned back with mechanical problems, leaving him alone over Germany. For half an hour, Howard attacked wave after wave of enemy aircraft, downing 4 and damaging several others. His Mustang absorbed hits but kept flying. When he finally landed back in England, his fuel tanks were nearly dry. But he had made it home. Every bomber in the formation he protected survived. He received the Medal of Honor. The Mustang received something more: respect. The numbers told the story more clearly than any combat report. In late 1943, American bomber losses averaged 8 to 10% per mission. 1 in 10 aircraft didn't return. 1 in 10 crews was killed, captured, or wounded. Those losses were unsustainable, mathematically guaranteeing the collapse of daylight bombing within months. But by mid-1944, with P-51 Mustangs providing deep escort, loss rates dropped below 2%. The change was so dramatic that German pilots began reporting hopelessness in combat. They weren't fighting individual aircraft anymore. They were fighting a system they couldn't defeat. The Luftwaffe had superior technology in some areas. The Me-262 jet fighter was faster than anything the Allies could field. But it required perfect runways, constant maintenance, and engines that failed after 25 hours of operation. The FW-190D was a magnificent interceptor, but it couldn't reach the altitudes where bombers cruised. The Bf-109K was nimble and deadly, but it couldn't stay airborne long enough to matter. German engineering had produced masterpieces of individual performance, but they had forgotten that wars are won by logistics, by sustainability, by showing up. The Mustang was never the best at any single thing. It wasn't the fastest, wasn't the most heavily armed, wasn't the toughest. But it was good enough at everything that mattered. And that 85-gallon tank behind the pilot's seat, the one everyone had called crazy, gave it the one capability that trumped all others: presence. The ability to be there over the target, when and where needed. That presence broke the Luftwaffe's back more surely than any technological superiority could have. German pilots stopped attacking. German commanders stopped scrambling. German factories stopped producing because bombers destroyed them unopposed. By July 1944, American P-51s were destroying more German aircraft on the ground than in the air. They strafed airfields, shot up trains, hunted anything that moved. The escort mission evolved into something more aggressive: fighter sweeps designed to draw out and destroy whatever remained of German air power. In a single week that summer, P-51 squadrons claimed 98 aerial victories. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to silver Mustangs bearing white stars. And still, that fuselage tank kept burning, kept feeding the Merlin engine, kept giving pilots time. Edgar Schmude never attended the victory celebrations. He didn't fly combat missions or give speeches about his contribution. He returned to his drafting table and kept designing aircraft, kept solving problems, kept trusting mathematics over fear. His name appears in patent filings and internal memos, but rarely in histories of the air war. The men who flew his Mustang into combat mostly never knew he existed, but they trusted what he built. They trusted the balance he had engineered, the shifting center of gravity that felt wrong until it felt right. After the war, Schmude's fuselage tank design became standard practice in fighter aircraft development. Modern jets carry fuel along the spine, in conformal tanks, in spaces that earlier engineers would have considered impossible. But it started with the Mustang, with an immigrant engineer who refused to accept that the rules couldn't be questioned. He proved that balance isn't a fixed point, but a moving target. That instability managed correctly becomes advantage. That crazy ideas sometimes change everything. Today, restored P-51 Mustangs fly at air shows around the world, their Merlin engines roaring with the same authority they had 80 years ago. Crowds watch them bank and climb, marveling at their elegance. And tucked behind the pilot's seat, invisible to spectators, sits that 85-gallon tank. No placard explains its significance. No announcer mentions how controversial it once was. But it's there, a quiet reminder of what almost wasn't, of what had to be believed before it could be proven. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington displays a P-51D suspended from the ceiling, frozen in flight. Visitors walk beneath it, snapping photos, reading about its combat record. Near the exhibit, a small bronze plaque lists the aircraft's specifications and mentions Edgar Schmood as chief designer. Most people walk past without stopping. His name means nothing to them. But without his willingness to break the rules, without his trust in mathematics over convention, the air war might have lasted years longer. Thousands more young men might have died in burning bombers over Germany. Wars are remembered by their loudest moments. The beaches stormed, the battles won, the speeches given. But history turns just as often on quiet decisions made in factory offices by people whose names never make headlines. Schmood's fuel tank wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode or shine. It simply worked, burning steadily mile after mile, giving pilots the gift of time and distance. That gift carried bombers safely to their targets and home again. That gift broke the Luftwaffe's defensive shield and opened Germany to round-the-clock bombing. The lesson endures longer than the aircraft. Innovation isn't always about doing something completely new. Sometimes it's about doing something old differently, about questioning assumptions everyone accepts as fact, about trusting calculations over instinct when the math points toward an uncomfortable truth, about being willing to make something unstable temporarily so it can become extraordinary permanently. The Mustang was unstable for the first 20 minutes of every mission. Then it became the finest fighter aircraft of the Second World War. Balance is everything, in engineering, in strategy, in life. Not the static balance of objects at rest, but the dynamic balance of systems in motion. The Mustang taught that lesson to everyone who flew it. Start heavy, burn through the instability, emerge into grace. Trust the process even when every instinct screams danger. Because sometimes the crazy idea, the one everyone dismisses, is exactly the idea that changes the world. Edgar Schmood believed that. He proved it. And 70,000 P-51 Mustangs carried his belief into combat, bringing their pilots home. The skies over Europe are quiet now. The thunder of engines and the rattle of guns have faded into history. But the legacy remains, welded into aluminum, drawn into the curve of a wing, calculated into the placement of a fuel tank. Schmood never called himself a visionary. He didn't need to. He just put the fuel where it needed to be and trusted that someone brave enough would take it from there. And they did, flying farther than anyone thought possible, fighting longer than anyone believed they could, winning a war that might have been lost without them.